Thanks to everybody for coming back to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. Today we will talk about industrial policy in the global economy with Penny Goldberg from Yale University. Penny, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Markus. I'm glad to be back.
Great. So Penny is teaching an expert on trade and international economics and also former chief economist of the World Bank. And today we talk about industrial policy, and the question is, what are the rationales for industrial policies? Of course, there can be industrial policies to correct some market failures, some externalities. There can be static externalities, but also dynamic ones, like learning by doing models, where you don't fully internalize that the dynamic effects, where your investments today might pay off dynamically, not only for you, but for the spillovers to other parts of the industry. There might be coordination failures you want to overcome. And importantly, there might also be some increasing returns to scale phenomenons where you really want to benefit from the increasing returns to scale and some, in particular, some infant industries. And some people argue at some positions that the government might have some information which the private sector does not have. That's probably less the case, but it could be in certain circumstances. So one is purely economically, there might be some market failures, economic reasons, but there might also be some geopolitical or geostrategic goals you want to have. You might strategically improve your terms of trade from purely country-specific optimization. You might do it for national security reasons. And you might also want to build up choke points towards other countries, or you might defend against choke points other countries have set up against you, so for predatory or other reasons. And of course, there might be also some reasons like climate change and green transition, which is also related to externalities, of course. And you might want to build up some resilience against shocks, which are not totally internalized by the marketplace. So if you look at it historically, the number of industrial policy measures which are coming into play is increasing dramatically in the last few years, and we have a sharp increase on that. And there's, of course, a tension between trade and industrial policy. Ideally, in an ideal world, you have competitive markets. They're competitive domestically. There's no industrial policy except for correcting some market failures. And internationally, you have free global trade. And once you have industrial policies which favor your own domestic industry over the foreign industry, and of course, then it questions the whole free trading system as well. So there's some tensions, some big tensions at the global scale coming from domestic industrial policy. So industrial policy can exploit the free trade system. And the question is, how should you react to it? If certain countries exploit the free trading system, should you just ignore it and enjoy other subsidies for certain products and enjoy the lower price? Should you impose counter tariffs to lean against it? Or should you start your own industrial policy or force even the other country to do some foreign direct investments in your country? And if the other country does some industrial policy, you do your own, there's a tit for tat. And at the end, we get in a worse outcome because each country is doing industrial policy to gain at the expense of the other country. As I mentioned, from a static perspective, you might of course, always have current choke points like antibiotics, very critical products, health products where you want to lean against and have some industrial policy. You might attract some increasing returns to scale industries because they're natural monopolies. And the question is, which country will get these natural monopolies? You might fight for these natural monopolies across countries through industrial policy. You might also not have a choke point at the moment, but in the future, you might have a choke point if one country does industrial policy, gains a technological leadership, and in the future it will be a choke point down the road. So you might also take these dynamic aspects into account. But overall, it might be always wise to think about when you impose industrial policy, what would a global social planner do? Is this industrial policy helpful from a global perspective, or is it more helpful from a country-specific perspective? And so that's perhaps one way we can think about it. But, I'm an outsider in this field, so we have the expert here with us today. And so we're hoping to gain all the insights from Pinelopi Goldberg. She will, give us the trade-offs of industrial policy and how it impacts the global economy. Thanks again, Penny, for being with us.
Thank you, Markus. Let me share my screen. Can everyone
Perfect.
see it?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Markus's introduction has. I'm sorry, I'm stuck.
Page down or?
Yeah, it's okay. So Markus's comments set the stage for what I'm going to talk about. And one takeaway from his introduction is that this is a huge topic, a very broad topic, that's receiving renewed attention because there has been a resurgence of industrial policy since 2021, not just in the United States, but worldwide. So I will start by trying to give you some sense of what my talk is going to be about. I'm not going to try to cover everything in the 45 minutes, 1 hour that we have. I think it's fair to say that almost all economists tend to be skeptical towards industrial policy. The arguments are well known. Industrial policy is often assumed to breed inefficiency. It can easily be captured by lobbies, by special interests, even when there are good reasons to consider industrial policy, externalities, market failures, the kind of things that Markus talked about. There is a fundamental informational problem that the government may face. And, Markus talked about the case where the government may have an advantage, an informational advantage, but usually we think about cases where the government has less information or perhaps less competence to do things right. This is summarized in the motto, the government cannot pick winners and losers. And the international context, there is the additional concern that we may end up with a race to the bottom if every country retaliates, every country pursues industrial policy, and then we are just wasting resources without potentially affecting outcomes. So for the purpose of this talk, I want to take the perspective of an international economist, and specifically an economist who's trying to think about how should we revise the rules of the game, how should we potentially revise policy rules in order to achieve better outcomes for the world, whatever the word better means. And I'll try to be more specific shortly. The reason I think it's different to view these things from the perspective of an international economist is because for international economists, the focus should be on cross-border spillovers. And I think it's fair to say that this has always been the attitude of most international economists, which is one of the reasons they've always had a more nuanced view towards industrial policy and subsidies in particular. So we all operate under the premise that we respect national sovereignty. And this implies that governments are free to do what they consider best in the interest of their economy. So if China wants to waste resources pursuing industrial policy, or the US wants to do the same, or Europe, it's their right to do so. And it's not the job of international institutions, multilateral institutions, to design rules to avoid such a waste of resources. On the other hand, to the extent that their actions impose costs on other economies, this becomes an issue that international institutions may want to regulate. Now, the problem is, from the point of view of cross-border spillovers, this, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, tend to be positive if one focuses on national welfare. And I think we would all agree that even though many of us may be trade economists and we study international trade is not the goal, is not the objective. International trade is the means towards an end. And the end is welfare, well-being. So from that point of view, it's very hard to come around the fact that subsidies in one country may result in lower prices for consumers in other countries. And so from that point of view, from the point of view of economic efficiency and national welfare, subsidies and industrial policy may seem beneficial. And this is one of the reasons several international trade economists would have said in the past, when a government subsidizes their own industry, when they pursue industrial policy, perhaps we should write a thank you note to that government. To a certain extent, this attitude is also reflected in the lack of clear rules governing industrial policy and subsidies in the World Trade Organization. And just to give you a very brief summary of what the current state of affairs at the World Trade Organization is, there are two kinds of subsidies: prohibited subsidies. These are export or import substitution subsidies that are clearly discriminatory. These are prohibited. And then there is a set that's called actionable subsidies. And this can be any subsidies that may impose harm on another country, but then the complaining country has to provide evidence. It has to prove injury. There are several notification requirements. So countries are supposed to notify the WTO whenever they engage in industrial policy, but this is not in force. So most countries do not comply with this notification requirement. So the general view is that subsidies, IP, industrial policy are not regulated, in contrast to tariffs, where the rules of the World Trade Organization have specifically been designed in order to address terms of trade externalities, to take into account the effects that tariffs in one country may have on other countries. So in contrast to tariffs and other trade restrictions, industrial policy has not been the focus of the World Trade Organization. And some people might say this is part of the problem. This is part of the reason that we see an enormous backlash against multilateralism. The perceived failure of this institution, as well as other multilateral institutions, to address some of the fundamental concerns people have had about industrial policy in the past. So with that in mind, let me point out that this attitude has changed recently, and partly in response to the fact that we see much more industrial policy right now. But it's fair to ask what exactly is different now. Why do we see a demand for studying these issues right now? One reason is that people are realizing, including international economists, that political economy matters. So it's not sufficient, it's not satisfactory to say from a national welfare point of view, we should be writing thank you notes to other governments when there are particular constituencies within countries that are hurt by other countries' industrial policy. Producers in many countries suffer, many plants have to close down, domestic labor may suffer, and all these concerns need to be taken into account because they are part of the reason that we see this enormous backlash against trade and multilateralism right now. A second reason is that many of the recent industrial policy initiatives target sectors where there are market failures. So, for example, renewables, electric vehicles. And we may want to debate whether industrial policy is the best way to address the market failures. But in principle, there is some market failure to start with. The third reason is that in these sectors, we may also have externalities in production, so learning by doing and dynamic comparative advantage, which again call for government intervention. A fourth reason that's not often sufficiently appreciated is that production and trade are these days organized in global value chains. And this means industrial policy in one country targeting one part of the supply chain may have effects on another part, on another segment of the supply chain located in a different country. So the cross-border effects may be very complicated and sometimes unanticipated. And finally, there are also concerns outside the domain of economics, for example, national security concerns. I will not go there today. I will mention that in passing when relevant. One concern I have in general with national security is it's a way to shut down the debate. So a government can always invoke national security concerns, as the government of the United States is doing right now, actually, with respect to tariffs. And then there is very little you can respond, given that we don't have access to national security data. So because of all of the above, there is a new demand for a new policy design. So one specific question that has come up is, should the World Trade Organization devise rules to regulate industrial policy? And if so, how should these rules be designed? And I'm sure that as I'm talking, many of you are thinking, the WTO may be dead now, who cares about it? I would argue that precisely because the WTO is in crisis right now, this is a very good time to think about these issues. I strongly believe that one day we'll all come back to the negotiation table, maybe on a multilateral basis, maybe on a bilateral basis. But many of the challenges we face today are global in nature, and eventually countries will have to negotiate again and talk to each other. And when this moment comes, it would be very good to have thought about these issues now that, at least for an academic or someone who's interested more in the intellectual aspects of these questions, this is a pretty quiet time to be thinking about these issues. So,
Penny,
with
can I
all
ask
this,
you one question
yes.
about how broad do you define industrial policy? For example, a country says, I encourage savings and cut down on consumption, and this way it changes the general equilibrium as well. It doesn't attach only to one particular sector, but it's for the whole economy. There's more savings and hence capital costs are going down. Would you include this as something the WTO should pick up as well, or this goes beyond industrial policy where you primarily hit particular sectors?
I think this is a very hard question. I mean, I will tell you what, if you give me a few minutes, I will come to this question.
Okay.
In the talk, how exactly do we measure industrial policy and what is industrial policy? Very briefly, I believe that there are policies, broad-based policies, including investments in infrastructure or educational policy, that have very specific, very strong implications for particular sectors, and this should be taken into account. Now, macro policies, I feel less certain about savings and investments, if they should be considered industrial policies. In general, I would say that I think of industrial policy as policy that has effect on particular sectors as opposed to the economy as a whole. Just to finish on the introduction, there is a team of people from academia that we got together to think about this issue systematically. So the effort was spearheaded by Ralph Ossa, Bob Steyer, and Dan Treffler. And this initiative includes Gene Grossman and Alan Sykes, who have prepared a conceptual paper on many of these issues that Markus talked about, and myself, and I've been in charge of the empirics in that effort. So on the empirical side, we try to look carefully at 4 case studies, for shipbuilding, electric vehicles, semiconductors, and renewables, in order to get some sense of what the main challenges and what the main insights are from these particular industries. The general focus of our work has been on cross-border spillovers for the reason I just mentioned. And by cross-border spillovers, I mean not only for the economy as a whole, because as mentioned above, and I will show that again, these tend to be positive, but also for particular constituencies, so specifically producers and workers. So a roadmap for the rest of the talk. What I intend to do is give you a very brief description of the 4 case studies, and then get to the main insights and open questions. I'll talk about what we mean by IP and how do we measure it. This is the question that Markus just asked. Then I will talk about cross-border effects, and then many open questions. And then I hope towards the end to also have time to talk a little bit about industrial policy for developing economies. This is a question often comes up. And the sectors we picked, the 4 sectors we picked, the 4 sectors we picked were picked with the recent industrial policy in mind, which has targeted mostly sectors that are very relevant to advanced economies. So I want to spend some time also talking a little bit about the relevance of these questions for developing countries. Very briefly, the questions that we tried to address in our work is, first of all, what kind of policies, subsidies, industrial policy have been applied in various countries in each of these 4 sectors? And specifically, are the conditions associated with these subsidies consistent with the World Trade Organization rules? Are they WTO compliant, or are they discriminatory? We try to think a little bit about motivation and effectiveness of these policies. These are issues that come up in the domestic context. I won't talk about this today simply because we don't have enough time. And then I will talk mostly about cross-border spillovers. Here is a very brief overview of the 4 case studies. The reason we selected these studies, apart from the fact that they've been in the news for the past 2 years, is also they cover a range of issues. So shipbuilding is a mature industry where we wouldn't expect any externalities justifying industrial policy. The other three sectors, semiconductors, electric vehicles, and renewables, are modern sectors of the economy with new technologies where we suspect the presence of externalities. On the second column, you see the authors of the various studies. Personally, I've been involved in semiconductors. In the last column, you see the state of each project. So in some cases, we could draw on excellent academic work. That's, for example, the case with shipbuilding. Not only is shipbuilding a mature sector, the work on shipbuilding is also mature. People have been working on that for over 10 years. There are 3 major publications. We have a body of evidence to draw upon. At the other end of the spectrum, to my knowledge, there was hardly any work on semiconductors in academia. There have been many writings in the policy domain. So we have some preliminary work in that area with many interesting results, but also many open questions. In electric vehicles and renewables, there is advanced work that can inform the debate. One thing that's interesting is if you compare the policy instruments that have been used in these sectors, they tend to be very different. And that comes to the measurement issue that I want to talk about next. So, for example...
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Which of these sectors would you say is the global value chain you mentioned before? So intertwinedness, is it the electric vehicles, which is mostly capturing?
Electric vehicles and semiconductors, the global supply chains are key for understanding the global spillovers. Mm-hmm. Much more so than in any other one.
Okay.
On measurements, so in shipbuilding, it's very hard to measure subsidies, and there have been a variety of tools, and as a result, the authors use a model-based approach to back out subsidies. The same is true in semiconductors. It's extremely hard to measure industrial policy. I will come to that in a moment. On the other hand, that's one point I want to make. Not all industrial policy is hard to measure. In some sectors, the main tool has been consumer subsidies, so demand-side subsidies. So, for example, this has been the case in electric vehicles, where they provided rebates to consumers buying electric vehicles, sometimes paired with domestic content requirements, but these are very well measured. The same is true for solar panels. Some of these measures target the demand side, and in these cases, it's very easy to measure them. This is to give you some sense of what we can measure in the electric vehicles market, for example. This shows for many countries, all major producers of electric vehicles, what kind of incentives they have provided, and some of these incentives are monetary, rebates, tax discounts, and so on. But there are others like free parking, green plates, special privileges, ease of registration that are hard to monetize, but they have been applied very widely. And all this we can measure very well. So when the industrial policy targets the demand side, it's very easy to measure. On the other hand, the subsidies and other interventions that target plants or firms, these are harder to measure. Not to mention the broad-based policies that Markus mentioned. And the challenges are related to the form of support. So in some cases, governments give grants. In other cases, the instruments are more involved. For example, in China, one of the common tools is below market financing. That means below market borrowing, but also below market equity injections. And that raises all sorts of measurement challenges. How do we measure the market here and what exactly this means? But a few studies on this show huge forms of support of that kind. Another challenge is there is a difference between ex ante and ex post measures. So sometimes you read government documents and there is a huge policy announced, but you cannot be sure that this policy will be taken up by firms. And so to the extent that you want to judge the effectiveness of a policy, you would like to know the ex ante measure and then see what happened. But this may be quite different from the measure we may observe ex post. Another challenge I will come back to that again and again is the difference between stock and flow. So in some cases, we can measure the flow of policy. We can see the current subsidies or the current policies implemented we don't always see easily what kind of policies governments implemented in the past, and dynamics matter in these cases, especially when we suspect dynamic comparative advantage. It makes a big difference whether we look at stock versus flow. And finally, there are issues of implementation. So, for example, in China, there are big push policies that are announced at the national level, and then the implementation is by provinces. So then one needs to be very careful not to double count. Sometimes people double count the policy that's announced at the national level and also the policy at the firm level. And so just to give you, some sense of how all these issues play out, here are some pictures, some graphs from the industrial policies that have been applied in semiconductors. These measures are derived by applying text analysis on the global trade alert database. This is the database that Simon Everett has put together in St. Gallen. It identifies all policies that may have effects on commerce. So this graph shows you a simple count of industrial policies in semiconductors since 2011. So I want to point out some features. This is just the count, and I'm sure everyone is thinking this tells us nothing about the amounts, which is what, as economists, we care about. But even the count provides some useful information. So the first one is that China, if you look at this measure that includes subsidies to firms, does not appear to be the top country in providing subsidies. You get a different picture if you look at national policies only. So the previous picture included firm-level policies. If you look at national policies only, then China comes first as the country that has enacted the most policies in order to support the industry of semiconductors. Another thing that's quite striking in this picture.
So can I ask you something about that? So is it true that the Chinese put out national policies and let different firms compete for these prizes, and that makes it so successful? Like, look at the car industry or EV car industry. There's so many firms popping up, competing very fiercely, and it's a competition in the domestic market which makes it an innovation very fast.
Exactly. This is
particular firms.
So the one thing I know for sure is in semiconductors, they let the provinces implement these policies, and then the provinces may engage in the kind of competition that you're talking about. The reason you see this big difference between firms, between measures that include firms and measures that don't include firms, is in Europe and the US. So that was the previous picture. We see policies that target specific firms. In China, the policies don't target specific firms. They're big push policies that are announced, and then the details are delegated to the provinces and to other market participants. So that's one insight. Another insight is that there are very few countries actually that are subsidizing in that sector. There are 6 major subsidizers, 5 out of which are already major producers. India is a newcomer, so India is trying to make big inroads in this industry. But the other ones, China, Japan, South Korea, and the US and Europe, of course, is not a country, a jurisdiction, all these have been subsidizing, are already producing semiconductors. Another fact that's quite striking in this figure is the absence of Taiwan. And we looked carefully. It was quite surprising that we don't find Taiwan there. And Taiwan is not, during that period, this is after 2011, does not seem to be engaging in traditional industrial policy anymore. And this speaks to this dynamic aspect that I talked about before, the difference between stock and flow. With Taiwan, we know from other documents, they have subsidized heavily early the industry's development, so 1987 onwards. But by now, they don't need to subsidize as much. All this was in terms of
Can I come back to this competition element? The effectiveness of some industrial policies, if you look at this too, that if I promote, competition among the firms and I give some prizes there, that it's much more effective innovations than if I just do grants to particular firms. Has anybody looked in this effectiveness of industrial policies?
I'm going to talk a little bit about effectiveness in the context of semiconductors. And actually, I will argue in the case of semiconductors specifically, the Chinese industrial policy has not been that effective so far, in the sense that China has not managed to reach the frontier. And it's an interesting question. Why not? But in general, I would agree with you. I don't know if someone has looked at this explicitly, but the anecdotal evidence is that the reason that China has been so successful is not that they throw so much money at the problem. This is part of it, but it's also the way industrial policy is implemented, namely starting small and then scaling up policies that were proven successful, delegating to provinces, and introducing this competition element that you mentioned. One brief comment on amounts, because I'm sure you are wondering. It's impossible to find measures that are comparable across countries when it comes to industrial policy expenditures, precisely because in semiconductors so many different tools are used. If you just focus on ex-ante measures announced in government documents, then China doesn't appear to be subsidizing much, but we know this is wrong because they announced a big fund in 2014, and this is the only case where we actually see an amount in the database. But then, if you take into account all the disbursement, all the policies all the expenditures that go to firms, then you get a different picture. The light green you see here comes from a different source, so not the GTA database, but from the JW Insights. This is a firm that provided data to the Financial Times, and our data came from the Financial Times. But I should point out that we're comparing apples and oranges here. I want to emphasize once more this dynamic element because I think
Can
this
I just
is
ask about the previous graph? There were no light green bars on the other countries because they don't do it, or there's no data exists?
There are no data exists. The only reason we show the light green bar is because we were not confident saying that the amounts that China has devoted to semiconductors are so small. So then we thought, what if we take the figure quoted by the Financial Times and we add it to what we have? I should also point out that for the other countries, we do have amounts in the GTA database for the policies they implement. So they do announce the amounts they tend to spend. For China, we don't see that. We only see it for the big push in 2014, but we don't see it for any other policy. So we know for sure that for China, we are missing a lot of the expenditures, the industrial policy expenditures. For the other countries, we have no strong reason to suspect that this is the case.
Thanks.
So coming back to this dynamic element, so this shows consumer subsidies for electric vehicles by region. And as I said before, everyone has subsidized in electric vehicles. One thing that's interesting is China starts subsidizing earlier than most countries in 2016. And then the subsidies at that time were high. They were extremely high per vehicle. But over time, they've been reducing subsidies. So by 2022, the subsidy per car, per electric vehicle is lower than in most other countries. The total amount spent is still huge because there are so many electric vehicles in China by virtue of the market, but the subsidy per car has gone down. Perhaps more importantly, so China also implemented a domestic content requirement policy starting in 2016. So this policy was in effect between 2016 and 2019. After 2019, we don't see any domestic content requirements when it comes to electric batteries. But in the meantime, China has established a dominant position in this market. So again, when you try to judge these policies, it makes a big difference whether we are looking at what's happening currently or whether we take into account what the history is in all these cases.
What's about, if you want the number plate, so you can get very easily in Beijing, you get very easily a green number plate for an electric car. But if you want the number plate for a new diesel engine car, you won't get it. You have to wait and go through a lottery. These measures, do you capture them too? And how much would you value them compared to the subsidies? Would you say they're much bigger?
Yeah. Sorry. So these measures are captured in the empirical analysis through time dummies. So they are taken into account. And but again, these are measures that apply to all electric vehicles. By nature, they're not discriminatory. So just to finish on measurement challenges,
So
even
can I
with
just, but if you're leading in electric vehicles, but not in the other technology, isn't it discriminatory that you favor the technology you are better in a sense?
So in this particular case, so China was not better in this technology. Actually, I will argue in a moment that it was worse. So they were pursuing it, very, very intensely for other reasons. And this is one of the cases where you might argue there are environmental externalities that may justify the policy. And of course, many would argue a carbon tax would be much better. But I will leave this aside for now. Just to wrap up on my measurement challenges, I mean, even when subsidies are well measured, it's very hard to judge whether a subsidy is high or low or distortionary or not without having some, I wouldn't call it theory, but some conceptual framework in order to think about their effects. And this also comes up in the case of judging Chinese subsidies. When you actually look at the amounts of Chinese subsidies, they tend to be very high, but in many cases, if you actually scale them by the size of the country, so the GDP or the population, they don't seem that high that large in comparison. And so one question that always comes up is what's the right metric? And for that, you need a conceptual framework. And again, I don't know if Jean and Alan will come on the show, but they provide such a conceptual framework, or what I would call a model-based approach. And let me say a few words about the model-based approach, simply because this is, in many cases, the approach used by the empirical studies. And it has the advantage that not only does it allow you to measure subsidies, but it also allows you to assess their effects, which you have. So, and for that purpose, you always have to adopt a model. And the idea behind this model-based approach, which now I'm referring to this model-based approach as a way of measuring industrial policy. The idea is you develop a model of the sector or industry, and then you can use this model structure to estimate the costs facing firms. This is very much in the industrial organization tradition of trying to back out costs from the model without cost data. And then when you try to explain the costs and compare costs across countries, one tries to account for all possible factors, everything you can think of that might drive differences in cost across countries. And the residual in such comparisons, so the part that you cannot explain by anything you control for, this part you can attribute to industrial policy. So this works quite well when there is a smoking gun. So if you look at the work on shipbuilding, there are multiple smoking guns suggesting subsidies, industrial policy by the Chinese government starting in the early 2000s. And then by using this approach, one can back out the subsidies employed. So this approach is particularly powerful when it's combined with some strong descriptive evidence. And importantly, it delivers an ex post measure. So it looks at the data generated by the model and the data for the sector, and it backs out, given the realization of outcomes, it backs out the costs and the subsidies. So as I said earlier, the main advantage is doing this allows you not only measurement, but also evaluation of industrial policy. And another advantage, to answer a question that Markus earlier asked, it captures also the implicit support that may happen through broad-based measures. So for example, it's been alleged that Taiwan promoted educational policies that were particularly advantageous to the semiconductor sector, so the development of the semiconductor industry. By employing the approach I just described, you're going to pick this up as a dummy that's specific to Taiwan. And similarly, if another country develops ports or in particular infrastructures, roads or airports, facilitate the development of a particular sector, again, we may capture that as a country-specific dummy when one looks at the cost for that particular sector. The obvious disadvantage is, as with all model-based approaches, that you are worried that the model assumptions may drive the conclusion. So it's important to have something reasonable and also conduct robustness analysis. It's incredibly time-consuming. So the shipbuilding study, which is one of the most convincing, I find, it took almost 10 years to publish. Personally, I think, we should be applying, when we try to use these studies for policy, we should apply the beyond reasonable doubt criterion as opposed to beyond any doubt criterion. Perhaps for me, the most important disadvantage is we can say in many cases that a government subsidized, but then we cannot point to the exact measure that they used in order to subsidize the sector. And that means also we cannot target this measure through policy or examine whether it's consistent with the principles of the WTO or not. So there has to be the main takeaway is that the model-based approach is not sufficient by itself either. So ideally, you're going to combine the two approaches, descriptive evidence and a model-based approach.
Can I ask about these models? Are these models static or dynamic? Because a lot of the benefits you invest today and then over the next 10, 20 years, there's a benefit from this industrial policy. To what extent do you capture this dynamic component as well in these models?
So the models have to be dynamic in order to capture these, some of the main forces here. And in fact, the model shipbuilding is dynamic. So overall, I think it's important to be willing to combine many different data sources, methods, and keep an open mind. And in the end, I would advocate for a case-by-case approach for each industry rather than, when it comes to measurement alone and coming back to the question that Markus asked at the very beginning, what exactly is industrial policy? This is a question that everyone has always struggled with, and one can always be paralyzed by the complexity of the issue. But if one takes a case-by-case approach, then it's often much easier to find a reasonable way of measuring the industrial policy. So now I'm going to talk about cross-border effects, so the main insights from the studies that we conducted. And as anticipated, when you look at welfare, in general, the effects are positive, and the reason is the effects that all these industrial policies have on consumer prices and varieties. When it comes to producers and labor, the effects are more nuanced. And there is a difference between industries like shipbuilding that are mature, you don't have any externalities, and industries producing newer products like electric vehicles, renewables, semiconductors, where there is learning by doing and production externalities, and where in the studies that we've looked at, there is evidence of large cross-border spillovers. So let me, give you some specific results, and when I talk about specific results, for the most part, I will focus on the producer side because for consumers, the results, the spillovers tend to be positive. If you look at shipbuilding, China enters the picture in the early 2000s, subsidizing heavily the industry through entry subsidies, investment subsidies, production subsidies. And what the studies found is that the business stealing effect dominates. These investments, the subsidies by China do not increase the productivity of the industry. They have the effect of stealing market share from the producers that at the time were more cost efficient, Japan and Korea, stealing the market shares from them and channeling business towards China. Now, from the point of view of regulation, one might wonder why were Japan and Korea more cost efficient at that time, so in the early 2000s. This was partly due to earlier subsidies by these countries to the shipbuilding industry. And this is perhaps one issue that also comes up today when now the United States is entering the race to develop the shipbuilding industry. And from a cost efficiency point of view, this seems absurd because it costs many multiples to build a ship in the United States compared to China. On the other hand, if you approach this from the point of view of fair competition, the reason China has a low cost of producing now is precisely because they subsidized the industry heavily in the past. So if you look at the industry, you get all these effects that people are worried about. At the beginning, they subsidize inefficiency. You get a lot of entry, a lot of small firms, unproductive firms. But then by 2013, there is consolidation. There is a big consolidation wave. All the small firms exit the industry. You are left with the big, more productive firms that have lower costs of producing. Now, you may wonder, why did China implement this policy? And there the rationale has something to do with economics, but not alone. There are national security reasons. So almost every major world power in the past has had a fleet. Actually, the United States these days is an exception. But if you look at history, all major powers had their own ships. The other reason, and there again, we come back to the issue of national welfare, is China is a major power in international trade. By subsidizing shipbuilding, they managed to decrease freight rates by around 6%. And this is something that benefited, obviously, Chinese exporters, but also world trade in general. And that's why I said before, if you look at it from the point of view of welfare, these subsidies often create positive global spillovers. With electric vehicles, the issues are a bit different. So electric vehicles have a very interesting supply chain that I will show you in a moment. But what happens with electric vehicle subsidies is all countries provide subsidies. Pretty much every electric vehicle producing country is providing consumer subsidies. What China did between 2016 and 2019, on top of the subsidies, they also implemented a type of domestic content requirement. Here is how the supply chain looks in this industry. So you have one of the main inputs for the production of electric vehicles is batteries, electric batteries, and they are a significant portion of the cost. So as of 2020, there were several major battery suppliers. The top three are Chinese. Most people have heard of CATL, that's the major one. But then there were also Korean and Japanese producers. And in fact, in the early years, so as of 2015, 2016, the Japanese and Korean producers, very much like in shipbuilding, they were producing at much lower cost batteries. One thing that's interesting about the supply chain, you see all these lines that show which battery suppliers supply which electric vehicle manufacturers. You see these lines crossing several times. So in the early years, many battery suppliers supply multiple companies. So these lines cross over. Another interesting feature of this industry is there is large learning by doing in the battery production. So not in the electric vehicle production as much, but in the battery production. The more batteries you produce, the lower the cost of producing battery. So what's the effect of the Chinese subsidies in that case? So by subsidizing electric vehicles, they increase demand for vehicles. That means they increase the demand for batteries. As the demand for batteries increase and battery producers produce more, they go down the cost curve and the cost declines. Now, because of the structure of the supply chain, these cost reductions benefit not only domestic Chinese vehicle producers, but they also benefit vehicle producers, or at least have the potential to benefit vehicle producers in other countries. They can benefit GM, for example, that sourced batteries from CATL. However, what China does between 2016 and 2019, it also implements an additional policy, namely not just consumer subsidies, but also the so-called white list. So you would only get the consumer subsidy if the vehicle you purchased had batteries from a Chinese battery supplier. So this way, they direct demand for batteries towards Chinese suppliers, which means Chinese battery suppliers can benefit from learning by doing. They can go down the cost curve much faster than everyone else, while Japanese and Korean vehicle producers lose. So if you put everything together in this case, by the way, other countries also implement these consumer subsidies. They also generate these learning by doing externalities for other countries that happen because of the nature of the supply chain, because of the fact that electric vehicle manufacturers purchase batteries from other countries. So other countries do that too. But because many of these countries do not implement domestic content requirements, the effects are not as discriminatory as was the case in China.
So there's a question from the audience. Peter would like to know, can China do it because it has this increasing returns to scale and large size? What about the smaller countries? They can't do this at all, so there's a big disadvantage for smaller countries. Would you agree with that? So there's a different optimal industrial policy for small countries versus large countries. And at the end, probably for these new technologies, only big countries with a big market can do it.
So in the case of electric vehicles, one of the justifications for consumer subsidies was to get the market started, to overcome informational asymmetries coming from the consumer side. So from that point of view, it also makes sense that other countries subsidize. In fact, the highest penetration of electric vehicles is in Norway. So 96% of new car purchases in Norway are electric vehicles. And this is no coincidence because Norway is subsidized very heavily. The purchase of electric vehicles, despite being a very small country. So, however, where I agree is that when it comes to learning by doing and these cost externalities, that's much more powerful for a large country. For a small country, it has much less impact.
I have another question concerning it's the value generation. So when you produce a car, you can say, oh, the value generation goes all to the battery or it goes to the car manufacturer. Do you think by doing industrial policy, you can also shift where the value is created? If you think about the iPhone, people say, the design of the iPhone, and Apple gets all the value, makes all the profits, while the producer of the iPhone who puts it together is not getting it. Through industrial policy, can you shift this, where the value is earned? Can you shift this as well?
I don't know. I haven't thought about this. So I don't think that was the case or that was the main motivation for electric vehicles. So shifting the value that accrues to a particular country, but it may be very relevant in other sectors. Semiconductors, for example, this is one of the issues that come up. So the point I want to make about electric vehicles is because of the structure of the supply chain, the subsidies end up having positive cross-border spillover effects on producers of electric vehicles in other countries, as long as there are no domestic content requirements. So implementation here matters. So one of the results of the paper that I showed in my summary before is that consumer subsidies are in fact global complements. So not only don't you have a race to the bottom, you have a race to the top. As every country subsidizes, you go down the cost curve much faster, which results in great benefits for the world and faster adoption of electric vehicles. When you combine all these policies with domestic content requirements, you reduce the positive spillovers, and you engage in blatant discrimination against foreign producers. Another issue that also comes up when you evaluate these policies is that the effects you get are going to depend on whether there is home bias in electric vehicle purchases or not. And we know there has been a lot of work on the automobile industry that shows a very strong home bias. So German consumers prefer German cars. Actually, this tends to be more pronounced, I would say, in the US and Europe. In Chinese do buy Teslas, actually. But that raises the question, is home bias itself a reflection of preferences, or is it the result of past policy? So, for example, to give you one example from electric vehicles, any price reductions for Chinese cars are not going to benefit US consumers simply because there are no Chinese vehicles in the United States. But we know that this is not just preferences, given that there is a 102% tariff on electric vehicles from China. This is very much the result of policy as well. So when we try to evaluate the effects of industrial policy, of subsidies, it's very often the case that these effects interact with other trade policies, and that makes the evaluation particularly challenging. Renewables are another fascinating sector. One point that Murray Gwant, among others, has made is that people put them together, but there are many differences between wind and solar panels. There are many differences in the market structures, in the trade costs, in the trade policies that have been applied to these industries. But generally, you get big positive spillovers in production arising against from learning and innovation spillovers. One interesting fact is that in the case of solar panels, you also get positive spillovers on labor. And this is because in order to install the solar panels, you need local labor. So actually, you get these positive spillover effects on local labor. So not only do they have positive spillover effects on consumers, but also on the producer side. To make a rather provocative statement, it's hard to study solar panels without coming to the conclusion that the Chinese have done a great service to the world by subsidizing solar panels. And then one may be concerned about issues of resilience, but even there, one interesting aspect of this industry is that in terms of energy security, solar panels or even wind turbines are very different from oil or gas, where you have a flow of inputs, right? That at any point in time, your foreign supplier can cut off the supply and blackmail you. This is not the case with wind and solar panels. You get them once, right? And it would be good, of course, to know how to produce them, but it's not the case that you are constantly dependent on a supplier who may be able to cut you off at any point in time. So the issues here are a bit different. And finally,
Can I ask you a question about the solar panels as well, because Germany was doing some industrial policy in the 2000s and developing a whole solar industry, which then essentially collapsed and moved on to China. So do you look at this industrial policy going wrong in a sense? It might have been a very positive thing for the environment, but from an industrial policy perspective, that you build up some certain technologies, get down the cost curve, but then subsequently it moves on to another country. Is this often the case, or that's a very rare event?
I haven't looked at this, so I cannot really answer it off the top of my head. So this is a case where I would say, to the extent that the industry shuts down, so to the extent that you subsidize, but the industry shuts down, this would create, at least in the short run, negative spillovers on the producers and clearly the people who lost their jobs. So from that point of view, yes, that would be true.
But I agree with you that actually bringing the costs down subsequently further is a very good thing for the environment.
Yeah. And finally, semiconductors. Actually, semiconductors, it's an interesting case. So I'm thinking in real time, this might be a case where we actually have some evidence of the mechanism you just described, where some part of the industry gets shut down. Semiconductors have this interesting structure of the supply chain where the design of the chips and specialized software and specialized capital equipment, they all happen in advanced countries. So in the United States, the software and design happen in the United States by mostly fabless firms now. There is another firm that provides specialized, very important equipment, ASML in the Netherlands. One firm in one country, so ASML in the Netherlands. And then you have the manufacturing in the foundries that these days happens in Taiwan, Korea, China, and Japan. So it happens in Asia. And then you have the last stage, assembly, testing and assembly, that happens in Malaysia and Thailand. So it's a fascinating supply chain for those who study supply chains because it's very fragmented, but at the same time, each stage of the supply chain is highly concentrated, geographically concentrated. So from the work we've done on semiconductors, there are two main insights. The first is, if you study industrial policy through many various tools that I described before, one major insight that emerges is that industrial policy in the past has been successful only when it was combined with access to foreign frontier technology. So if you look at the success of TSMC in Taiwan and Korean firms, they managed to make so much progress and reach the frontier in the case of TSMC, precisely because they were in close cooperation along the supply chain with firms, chip designers and software providers in the frontier country, namely the United States. On the other hand, this is a case where China, despite the allegedly huge amounts that they have thrown at the problem, have not managed to reach the frontier. China has a very large market share in the so-called legacy chips, older generation chips, but they have not managed to produce the cutting edge technologies. Although supposedly they're making great progress, they've made great progress within the last year, but even so, they started dedicating these huge amounts in 2014 that we can see in the documents that we can document And to this day, they have not managed to catch up. This is very different from the experience we've had with other Chinese industries. And if you ask the question, why is it that China has not made such progress in that particular industry? One hypothesis that I find plausible, and we're still working on this, is because China at various points has been cut off from access to frontier technology. And, one insight I've had is that this actually has been quite successful. Talking again about the general question of what exactly is industrial policy, the United States has implemented export controls. From an industrial policy, from an effectiveness point of view, these export controls have been incredibly effective in slowing down technological progress in China. So this is another, facet of industrial policy. We also find that there's substantial learning by doing. But all this learning by doing is driven by international spillovers in learning. So it's not only the case that industrial policy is only successful when there are these collaborations across the border, but industrial policy itself generates positive spillovers. And just to give you an idea where in the data we see that, so this shows you the price per wafer for one particular technology, chip technology. These are 90 nanometers chips. And so the leaders in that technology were Taiwan and Japan. So these are the orange and the pink lines in the graph. And you can see they start producing in 2005. Until 2008, 2009, the price goes very rapidly down, which is suggestive of rapid learning by doing. It's not, there could be other things going on. And, these are things we need to figure out through the empirical analysis, but that shows, that there is some very suggestive evidence of learning by doing. Then in 2009, China enters the picture. This is a follower. It enters exactly the same technology, and you can see that China enters at a much lower price. And after that, the price still goes down, but not at the same fast rate that Taiwan and Japan had experienced. And so when you look at this, is that there are other explanations. For example, it could be that this additional competition from China induces everyone to reduce markups. So we do account for that in the latest version of our paper. Another explanation is that maybe this is evidence of subsidies. This is how the Chinese subsidize. This allows them to enter at a much lower price early on, capturing the advantages of learning by doing. However, there are two factors that argue against that. The first is that we see exactly the same pattern for every other country. So this is a similar graph for what is called the mainstream technology. So these are chips with widths between 45 and 90 nanometers. And again, you see exactly the same patterns with multiple countries entering late, 2 to 3 years after Taiwan and Japan in this case, but they always enter at a much lower price. And then the price trajectory is less steep compared to Taiwan and Japan. So in other words, what this suggests, and these graphs have to be interpreted within the framework of a model we developed, so we account for all kinds of other things. But this is essentially the kind of data pattern that identifies these cross-border spillovers. Countries who enter the industry, this particular technology, with a 2 or 3 year delay, can benefit from the cost advantages that the leaders in that technology had achieved through learning by doing. So these cross-border spillover effects seem to be very interesting. And one interesting question is, how are they realized? What exactly accounts for them? And we have several interesting hypotheses for them, but in the interest of time, I think I'm out of time.
Just also the previous figure, there was a huge jump in costs in Europe, and also in Japan.
I don't know what this is. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is one particular year, 2015. And these are transactions-based data, so it could be that there was some particular transaction that accounts for that. So just to wrap up, it's obvious, but I think it needs to be emphasized that whenever we think about the merits of subsidies, they need to be evaluated. All the arguments need to be made on a case-by-case basis. And there is a big difference here between traditional industries like shipbuilding or steel or aluminum, all these industries where we don't suspect any externalities, and newer products where these externalities do generate positive spillovers. Implementation and specifics matter, so subsidies per se, industrial policy per se may generate these positive spillovers, but when you combine them with domestic content requirements, then they reduce the benefits and then they generate these negative spillovers. But in principle, when we think about how to regulate these policies, there is, I think, the argument that these subsidies, these industrial policies can be global complements has some merit in the context of these new industries. So some open questions that emerge through this analysis. I think the most important one is how do we deal with dynamic comparative advantage, so cases where past subsidies are potentially responsible for current cost advantage. So this comes up even in traditional sectors, even in sectors like shipbuilding or aluminum or steel. When we see one country having much lower costs today, it could be the result of past industrial policy. A second one I already mentioned is that subsidies often interact with other trade policies. So, for example, subsidies and tariffs in the case of electric vehicles, home bias. Is it a demonstration of preferences or past subsidies? And in general, you have this difference between stock and flow. That's quite important, especially in cases where we have dynamic comparative advantage. So on one hand, this dynamic comparative advantage provides a potential justification for subsidies, at least when these learning spillovers are external to firms or external to countries. But at the same time, this dynamic comparative advantage makes this distinction between stock and flow very important. And so the general question there is, where do we start the clock? This is something that we have to come to an agreement. Finally, some thoughts on industrial policy for developing countries. So the four sectors I've talked about have little relevance for developing countries, low-income and middle-income countries. With the exception of India, most of these countries are not present in the race to invest in these sectors. But there is a big question that these countries face. How should they respond to the current wave of industrial policy? And traditionally all the multilateral institutions had advised developing countries to trust markets, to stay away from industrial policy. But now there is a concern that advanced countries are leading by bad example. They're all subsidizing, and what should exactly be the developing country response to this wave of subsidies and industrial policy? So in my view, the issues facing developing countries are fundamentally different. With very few exceptions, the sectors under consideration are traditional. They are not these sectors where we have big learning externalities. They're not innovative sectors. Externalities are unlikely in some cases. One may be able to make the standard infant industry protection argument, but for the most part, we may be talking about industrial policies targeting agricultural products or specific other traditional sectors of the economy. However, in that case, there are different arguments supporting industrial policy, and one person who has worked recently on this is Tristan Reed. He has, in my opinion, a very nice paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, Export-Led Industrial Policy for Developing Countries. And one argument that I find quite convincing is that developing countries often do not have the fiscal space for broad-based policies, so they need to focus on specific sectors. And then the question is, how do you pick the sectors? It's the usual question governments face. And Tristan's answer is perhaps it's hard to pick winners, but at least governments can try to avoid picking losers. And he lists some criteria that governments could potentially adopt: international market growth, competition, comparative advantage, technological relatedness. Importantly, he emphasizes that countries should respect the principles of multilateralism. So perhaps the US, not that we support this, but the US or Europe or China can disregard the principles of multilateralism. Being pragmatic, developing countries cannot afford to do so, so they have to play by the rules. In many cases, this approach calls for broad-based policies that target specific sectors. So, for example, a good example is the case of Costa Rica, that has pursued a very successful industrial policy. And a lot of the measures they took were not grants to a specific firm. They were not targeting specific recipients in the country. They did engage in broad-based policies, investments in infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, education, but with Intel in mind. So many of these investments did benefit Intel specifically, and that allowed, and that comes in, again, back to another question Markus asked, that allowed Costa Rica also to go up the value chain. So
With what in mind? Intel in mind? A particular company or?
Intel, right, that invested in Costa Rica. So Costa Rica at the time was a big exporter of coffee and bananas and tourism, of course.
Yes.
And now it's a major player in medical devices and business services. But still, this raises the question, if everyone behaves like Costa Rica, we may have a race to the bottom, if every country does that. And so I think if we make the case for international coordination and rules, this case is particularly strong for low-income and lower middle-income countries, because this race to the bottom argument is particularly acute in these cases. Even when there might be good reasons for countries to subsidize domestically, then we are back, to this trade-off between raising your own country out of poverty and going up the value chain, but at the same time facing a potential race to the bottom. That said, my take is that these issues may be less pronounced in the context of these innovative sectors that modern industrial policy started in advanced countries. And so...
Can I just ask you about the developing countries or the emerging markets? What's about forced FDIs? And, that's, of course, works only for large countries, but can you not force, like what China did for many years, to bring technology into your country by saying, if you want to sell in my market, you have to, do some FDI in my market and develop the technology in the home market. Would you see forced FDI, foreign direct investments, as an element of industrial policy as well, or do you think it's beyond industrial policy?
It's clearly an element of industrial policy, and as you pointed out, it's something that works only for large countries. In the case of China, many companies lamented these deals, but they really wanted access to a very large market. And now that you mentioned it, it's actually one reason that China didn't manage to make such progress in semiconductors. There is a very interesting PhD thesis by John Minich from MIT. It's actually in political science, that reviews industrial policy in China. And one of the questions he asks is, why was the Chinese policy in semiconductors not as successful? Why didn't they manage to have this technology extraction in semiconductors? And his answer, that again I found personally convincing, is that the domestic market in China for semiconductors used to be very small until recently, because the Chinese were engaged in processing trade. They were importing inputs to China and then exporting chips to other countries, which made them dependent to foreign input suppliers and foreign export buyers. So they couldn't afford to cross foreign suppliers or foreign exporters. And at the same time, the domestic market, in contrast to what was going on in the automobile industry or in other industries, the domestic market for chips at the time was very small, so they didn't have any negotiating power. And all this changed around 2005, 2006, when the Chinese domestic market started becoming larger. So I would say that one reason to be skeptical or at least careful with industrial policy, a lot of the policies that worked for China may not work for other countries, because many policies may work for a very large country. They may not work for a very small country. And so one cannot just simply copy. So this is my slide, the slide with my concluding thoughts. I think I'm already quite late. And overall, I think that the modern industrial policy needs to be approached with a non-dogmatic, with an open mind. There is a big difference between traditional industries and innovative sectors, where industrial policy actually can play a positive role in the sense of policies in other countries being global complements. Implementation matters. And finally, I think the regulation and international coordination is, in my opinion, much more important in the context of developing countries. Overall, I would advocate a case-by-case approach. And with that, let me thank you all for your patience and your attention.
Thank you. Thanks a lot to all of you, and thanks a lot to you, Penny, in particular. Let me just conclude with one question, and the one is, do you see this new framework, how to deal with this? There must be the common principles. Of course, it's a case-by-case approach. Do you see that more coming out of the WTO, their research department, or do you think all of academia has to develop essential this common principles and the case-by-case approaches?
So I don't think the WTO is engaged in this discussion directly. There is a lot of interest, I would say, in academia among people like myself who have an interest in policy. Mm-hmm. And ideally, we would like to be able to communicate our insights to the multilateral institutions one day. If you remember when you asked me to participate in the fall, I said, well, one challenge is I don't quite know what I think about these issues. It's not that I have a one-line summary of my views, and I think it's fair to say that many people have the same view that the issues are very complex and we need to study them, but at least we need to be thinking about those issues.
Yes. Well, thanks a lot. I think it's great that you're thinking about these issues and developing essentially a framework how we can deal with it. And it's also interesting to notice that it's so different from industry to industry. So we have to go case by case. So thanks again, and let's keep watching new developments, and we're looking forward to this report when it comes out. I hope to see you soon, and all the participants to see you again for the next webinar in the subsequent weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Markus.
Thanks.